Hello out there, thinkers, linkers, and mappers. We are really happy to host a series of conversations around the topic of tools for thinking. Our longer-term goal is to spark a diverse, connected, shared memory that will help us make important decisions together as humans. Our near-term goal with these podcasts is to interest startups in being part of BetaWorks' upcoming accelerator, Think Camp. BetaWorks is a New York City-based incubator and accelerator. They've run several camps before on topics from bots to synthetic media and voice interfaces. You can find out more about Think Camp in this domain by going to betaworks.com/camp, all lowercase. I'm Jerry Mikulski, your interlocutor and obsessive mind mapper. Our topic today is, are we totally blowing the creative potential of computers? And my guests are Molly Mielke and Sam Arbesman. Molly is the founder of Moth Minds. Sam is with Lux Capital. Neither of those terms are self-explanatory or self-evident. In fact, in Ambrose Bierce's Devil's Dictionary, I love his definition of self-evident. He says, evident only to oneself. Like, makes way too much sense. So Molly, what is Moth and what sort of lens are you bringing into our conversation today?
Yeah, well, lovely to be here. My name is Molly, and I am working on many things, Moth being one of them. Moth is a fund, actually, that has a portion of it allocated to grants, and it has a thesis of investing in young people really early and believing in them pre-idea. And I'm really interested in just creating more kind of systems and fellowships and structures that take bets on people and their ideas, even if they take a very long time to come to fruition. And this is kind of my first experiment in that realm. And more broadly, I am a writer, editor, investor, clearly, and I work for Stripe Press. And I'm very interested in like stories of technology and both past and present, as well as kind of the culture of technology at large and like the kind of agency and innovation spirit that it has. And I've in the past done research on creativity in human beings, and I'm excited to kind of like broaden that to more like innovation and agency more broadly.
And everything you just said makes me really excited for our conversation right now. Thank you. Sam, Lux. When I went off on my own in 98, I almost called myself Lux Informatica. And then I thought, what an obscure, I shouldn't go there. But Lux Capital makes sense.
Yeah, so I guess we went obscure, and it's worked out pretty well for us. So Lux Capital is a venture capital firm devoted to investing in kind of emerging technology, or probably the more fun way to describe it is anything that feels a little bit like science fiction. That's the kind of thing that we're thinking about. So we're thinking about everything at the frontier of biology, things in outer space, things in AI, kind of all over the place, and especially at the intersection of lots of different areas. That's actually one of the things I like to think about, is kind of how to intersect often unexpected ideas and concepts and fields together. And so my role at Lux is, I guess, a delightfully vague title of scientist in residence. And so I'm trained as a computational biologist and kind of complexity scientist. And my role really is to survey the landscape of science and technology and find areas that we should be involved with. And based on that, find people to invest in and companies to invest in, connect those areas that I'm exploring to our portfolio of companies that we've already invested in, and also just kind of engage with the public around these ideas, around kind of ideas at the frontier of science and technology. And so one area that I've been thinking a lot about is kind of is how to better allow for the intersection of ideas, kind of this unexpected creativity and kind of cross-pollination of information. And obviously, computers are really, really good at this kind of thing. And whether or not it's helping to like democratize information flow, connect various different ideas together, or even just allow people to kind of build things that they otherwise could not build, and kind of, I guess, reduce the gap between some weird idea they have in their head and something out in the real world. Computers are great at that. And so I'm very interested in, I guess, this topic from many, many different angles, and I'm excited for the conversation.
And what I said about Molly, it doubles up for you. This is a great combo. Thank you both for being here. it feels like we're at this interesting kind of liminal, thresholdy, limbo-y moment where lots of things are going to change. I think this is just my own sentiment about this little piece of couple of years that we're living through, but things are going to change pretty dramatically. And 20 years from now, when we look back on this moment, we'll be like, wow, we didn't see that thing and that thing and that thing were going to grow so large in the landscape and kind of eat our worlds or whatever it is. Just like 2007 is the debut of the iPhone, and it's hard now to imagine a world without a smartphone. But it did exist, and it's hard to imagine a world pre-internet, but that did exist. And the cross-pollination you're describing is like hugely important, but also I have this feeling that from the 1968 mother of all demos that Doug Engelbart famously showed that motivated a whole bunch of people to get into this space, very little of even what was in there about collaboration and shared ideas has made it into useful tools and products. Instead, we were delivered personal productivity and personal computing, and both Bill Gates and Steve Jobs had to be dragged kicking and screaming to do networking and the internet and all those kinds of things. It's very interesting. Molly, when you say that, like, are we not getting the creative potential of these tools? What sparks that for you, and where are we in that moment?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. I think that for the most part, a lot of the incentives of technology are not exactly aligned for like kind of realizing these longer term ambitions of basically new computing paradigms of like how we collaborate together. And that is often just a matter of timescale of like how fast venture is expecting a return. But there's also just like other problems of just, I think that it is really hard to realize some of these concepts that were kind of originally theorized when people don't have the expectation that computers can even do that. I think that those visions are kind of relegated to niche areas in computing where people are still kind of like harboring and trying to realize little bits of like, oh, what if we were completely like collaborative and, you know, everything was shared and there was much more democratization of information flow and even software itself. But that is something that has to be supported by more people than it actually is. And so it's unfortunate that I think that the consumer preferences err more on the side of like the individual things that are fast and cheap. And that just kind of pigeonholes us in a direction that doesn't have a lot of room to innovate. But I don't know. I think that there's more forces at play as well of just kind of like putting more ideas in conversation with each other. And I think Sam has actually thought about this more than I have. I'd be curious what he thinks.
Ball is in your court.
Yeah. And so this is a really interesting question. And I wonder if, and part of it is that, especially when we kind of think about how to build like highly collaborative tools and kind of allow things to kind of like actually create a commons of information and that we can all kind of draw upon. In some ways, I feel like even though a lot of these ideas have been around for decades, we're still sort of in the realm of like profits. Where it's like there's these people who kind of advocate things that are almost like perfect idea, like platonic ideals, and we haven't quite gotten it to the okay, let's actually figure out something that's pretty good, not quite there, but make it real. And so it's I guess what I'm trying to say is I wonder if there needs to be almost like a certain sense of compromise of saying, okay, like, it's okay if we don't create the perfect kind of thing, but we need to actually make greater efforts in actually creating kind of collaborative, like actually kind of collaborative creative tools. That being said, I think there has been a lot of progress here. First of all, I would say like we should not discount what has already come. And we've done a lot of interesting things. And I think it's also related to that, the fact that like some of these things require like a slow burn. Like it takes a while to allow some of these things to advance. And there's some concept, I forget who is responsible for it, but I think it's called the like the long nose of technology or the long nose of progress or something like that, where the idea behind it is that it takes at least like 15 years from the advent of an idea to its actual instantiation in technology. And obviously this has been a lot longer than kind of the mother of all demos to our current time. But some of these things just take time. And so maybe there's this kind of just this tension between exactly what Molly was saying of like, okay, like the desire to have like move fast and break things versus recognizing it's okay to be patient and recognize that some of these things kind of take time to get right. And it's okay to also just like bring things down from the prophets in the mountains and kind of make them okay versions of what we actually need.
It's really interesting. There is a thing I just Googled. There's the long nose of innovation.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, there it is.
That is a thing out there. And I was kind of going to offer that in my perception, I used to be a technology trends analyst back in the 90s. And it seems like this stuff moves ahead in a step function. And before all of that, I actually worked at Mobil Oil before it was ExxonMobil, and was in their freight rate transportation sort of division, telling the field how much it costs to move packaged lubricating oils from one place to another. And I went to a conference about EDI, electronic data interchange. And I was not a technician or a programmer, but I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I watched many years later as e-commerce showed up, then XML shows up, then a bunch of other things show up. And every time, like, the whole field kind of bumps up a ways, but then goes on and kind of gets exhausted and does the same thing for a really long time until there's a break and some breakthrough. And then a lot of these breakthroughs are constrained by either what designers of software think people are capable of, or maybe just reality. And I don't know which this is, but I've watched the desktop metaphor and Microsoft Office kill off a bunch of really interesting products in the world. So there was a product called Pearl Trees, which was a really nice ideation thing. It was a little French company, and it made little circles that had, assertions and data and so forth. And the thing they got really right was that I could connect my Pearl Trees to one of yours by reference, so that in my tree about innovation, it would link to your long nose of innovation thoughts, and whatever you curated there would show up slightly visually differently for me. That was really good. And then one day, after Tumblr got really popular, they redesigned the whole thing, and it looked like rectangles going down the screen. Mm-hmm. And they basically lobotomized their cool little French thing. Similar, I was a big fan of using Prezi as a storytelling tool. Prezi lobotomized itself more recently. And the endless zoomable whiteboard that I could tell stories in like fluidly is gone. So I have this fear that very often, like Microsoft Office is this huge tractor beam that stops things from being interesting and different, either because that's the preconception we have, so we're all going to write toward that, and that's where the audience is, so that's where startups are going to get funding, or something else. I don't know. And then across the fence, there's augmented reality, gesture interfaces. We've recorded one of these podcasts with John Underkoffler, the guy who designed the G-Space UI that Tom Cruise uses in Minority Report. Like, well, that's interesting, right? So where are the interesting sort of edges in this space? Where do you look for inspiration or happiness to get away from these tractor beams and some of the weird dynamics in our business?
Yeah. So one thing I would just add to the tractor beams is also just, and I think Jerry, you and I have discussed this a little bit before, that there's a great deal of like historical ignorance in the world of technology, and I think that also contributes to this, which is and sometimes it's even like proud ignorance. Like, you kind of say, okay, like new is always better and the old is irrelevant, and so we're constantly, well, sometimes just reinventing things that we've already seen, or we're ignoring things that could be great ideas that were abandoned for market reasons or technology reasons or a whole bunch of different things. And I think it's, and so in terms of like how to find some of these kinds of things, it actually, I think we really should be like digging in the archives and actually finding old things, whether it's looking through old computing magazines from the 70s and the 80s and 90s, or looking at technical papers and seeing, why did these things fail? Like, was there a good reason? Like, and so like the analogy I would use is like with bicycles, like, we don't have the bicycle with the really big wheel anymore, and probably for good reason, because it probably was incredibly dangerous. But there are many other things that people tried that are now actually not such bad ideas. So in the early days of cars, and there were a lot of different mechanisms for cars. And there was the internal combustion engine, but there were steam cars. There were steam powered, like Stanley Steamer, the steam powered cars, and there were also electric cars. And one of the reasons why they didn't take off is partly due to battery power, like battery technology. And of course, we've now had advances in battery technology. And so I think being able to expand like our sense of what is actually the possible, as opposed to saying, okay, let's take everything we currently have and just kind of iterate a little bit more, is really important. And so in terms of like what are the edges, I'm not always certain, but I think we just need to expand our kind of expand our focal lens much more, and like, yeah, just find the old stuff that is really interesting to look at.
I totally agree with all of that. I think for me, I tend to look towards and find myself very fascinated by the innovation that like indie tools do, just like ones that are kind of experimenting and they don't have a lot of pressure to make something that is making a ton of money. I think that oftentimes they're the ones who are digging into the archives and pulling out something really interesting and being like, wait, why did this fail? Oh, it was more of like an actual funding problem and not an actual like problem of the technology, which I actually think is a pretty common story, not just funding, but there's so many other forces at play for why things have failed in the past. And actually, for the most part, in the case of technology, oftentimes it's not actually that the technology was never like brought to a point where it worked and was like interesting technically and like pushing the bounds. It was more that the people didn't kind of work together well, or like they ran out of money or something like that, or they couldn't actually popularize it. It seems like that is oftentimes the biggest gap, is actually just communicating why the thing matters, why it's worth investing in learning a new tool. And that seems to be something that is we're getting better at, but it is still like a treatment that kind of needs to be applied to the indie tools for those ideas to kind of become the profits that they could be, to kind of keep us from just consolidating down to like the Microsoft Office baseline that we continue to be like trotting along.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think oftentimes when there is this kind of Cambrian explosion of indie tools is often at the early stages of some sort of platform. So whether it's like in the early days of the Macintosh or early days of the internet, like when people are just kind of playing around and trying things, they're not necessarily thinking in terms of, okay, how can I capture all of the market, because it's probably still very small. It's more just kind of people playing around and having a sense of curiosity and play. And we have this like evolutionary divergence, but then oftentimes a Microsoft comes in or some other kind of certain thing comes in, and then we have this mass extinction. And the mass extinction is exactly like, it's not necessarily for technical reasons or other good reasons. It's for, like other little things. It could just be, like the co-founders didn't get along or whatever. And so how can we, and the nice thing with technology, unlike biology, and like we can see the fossils, but we might not be able to actually recreate the organisms, but we can recreate the actual technologies that were there, like that have since gone extinct. And so it might be worthwhile actually going back and looking at like the Cambrian explosions at the early days of certain platforms.
Would you like to take a side excursion into HyperCard for a moment?
Always.
Since it sounds like that's a story that you love that fits right into what you just said. So could you tell us a little bit about your explorations there?
Sure. I guess, should I explain a little bit about HyperCard in case?
Yeah, please.
Just in case.
Because like, despite how revolutionary it was, and it was my address book and calendar and note-taking software for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years back in the day, and then just like vanished. So
so HyperCard was it was a computer program that came with the it was built into the Macintosh beginning probably in the late 80s.
So Bill Atkinson blackmailed Apple to ship it with the Mac.
Yes, that is an even better story. So right, and I think and one of the reasons it became so widespread is because of the fact that it was built into the Mac, and basically HyperCard was I guess the best way to describe it is a very easy tool for building essentially like web pages for yourself on your own machine. And so you built a stack, and so a stack was a collection of cards, and so each card would be the equivalent of a single web page, or and then together they would be a site. And it mimicked sort of the Seymour Papert idea of like the low floors, high ceilings kind of thing, where it was very easy for people who were not programmers to go in and play with that. And so you could add buttons, and you could add text, and you could have like little data links and things like that. But then underneath, you could then make the buttons do things. You can actually program them. There was a language called HyperTalk, and so it was almost trivial to make a button that you could press it and it would make a little boing sound or whatever it was. But then you could also do a whole bunch of more sophisticated things. So, for example, the computer game Myst, like the early version of that, was actually built in HyperCard. I think, and people built a huge host of things. And the idea was, in HyperCard, it was a program to allow people to make their own programs. And because it was so easy to get involved and kind of play with it. And there were lots of kind of examples already of what was possible. It suddenly, at least in my mind, kind of opened people's minds to what was truly like, what was the space of potential things that could be done with a computer. And so for me, like when I think about one of the issues around kind of like coding tools, even ones that are kind of designed to democratize tools or democratize coding, is that if you don't know how to program a computer, then you don't even realize the space of potential things you could be doing. And so, but HyperCard, by making it so much easier to actually build things, it then made it that much more possible to say, okay, I could build a flashcard tool. I can build a calendar. I can build, I think when I was little, I made like a password generator, like a random password generator. And actually for me, I mean, HyperCard was the on-ramp for me to actually learn how to program. And I have since gone on to like more.
Are you beyond HyperTalk now?
I'm beyond HyperTalk. I would not. I am still very much I
miss HyperTalk. That's for sure.
An amateur in terms of my programming. Although I've been doing it now, I guess for decades. But HyperTalk was that really nice on ramp that allowed me to kind of. It gave me the comfort in building, but it also just showed me that computers were not just for consumption. They were also for creation. And for me, in many ways, it actually, and to I guess take computer history even like one step earlier. So before we got a Macintosh, my family's first computer was the Commodore VIC-20. And this was before I knew how to program. And so I was a little kid. I was probably 3 or I was like a small child. I think that was when we first got it. And the one interesting thing with the Commodore VIC-20 is you had like cassette tapes that would go on the Commodore data set. And that would be how you get programs, but you could also just program them yourself using kind of a version of BASIC. And so during that time period, there were these type-in programs. You get a computer magazine and would have just code in the back or throughout the magazine, and you could just enter it in. And so for me, when I was a little kid, I didn't know how to program, but I saw my father typing in these programs, and I could see a clear relationship between the text that was being written and what was actually happening on the screen. And so I saw not only kind of the relationship between code and its effect, but I also saw the ability, like I recognized that computers were not just things that you consume the programs or you kind of use them. There was this kind of like very open relationship, and HyperCard I think was an even more powerful instantiation of that kind of thing. And so for me, and I think many people who either used HyperCard or learned about HyperCard in the years afterward, it's viewed as this kind of forgotten golden age of like, oh my God, like there was this thing and now we've forgotten it. And like, how can we kind of get back to that? And in many ways, right. And it died. And there are still things that, there are kind of ported versions of it. And you can actually, I think you can use HyperCard on the Internet Archive. And there's lots of ways of doing that, but it doesn't quite capture that kind of open-ended, like wonderful ability of like, you can just like build anything you want as easily as you like. Now I have to also admit that like, and some of my own memories of this might be being warped by the kind of like the golden age kind of fuzzy glow. And so maybe it was a lot messier than I remember, but yeah. So anyway, that's a little bit about HyperCard and kind of how, and I think, and so in terms of, technological history, I think like we can do far worse than revisiting HyperCard and the reasons why it was so successful.
But my memories of HyperCard are suffused with a warm glow as well. So I don't know that you're exaggerating very much here. Molly, is there a HyperCard incident in your life? Is there something you hit or got to use that was sort of open and creative in that way that fuels your critique and your desire for better stuff?
I wish. I think I was a little too young to have played with HyperCard, except for in the Internet Archive version. But I think that my equivalent, the closest I have, is actually Photoshop. I was turned on to Photoshop at a very, very young age, and it got me very interested in just like how computers can manipulate and create really wonderful things that were like visions in my head that I could realize. And I think what really struck me about Photoshop was that I tackled it at a young age because I had help from my dad, who was very into photography at the time. And I got super into it and it became like my playground essentially. But I think that is a very, very, very uncommon experience. And it is incredibly intimidating to most people. And that's actually a huge part of why I became so interested in like how computers can facilitate creativity for human beings, because I realized that the packaging of the programs that I had used as like sandboxes were not feeling the same at all to everyone else around me. In fact, they were incredibly intimidating and everyone was avoiding them. And that was kind of formative in like how I was thinking about what I wanted to do, because I really liked to help people learn how to express themselves. And I was so enamored by just like digital image making. And that's how I got much more interested in just like tools like Figma and things like that are kind of like dumber down, more approachable versions, and realizing how much even just like the branding and the colors and like how many tools you're offered really impacts what you think you can do and whether you think the tool is made for someone like you. But yeah, Photoshop, that was definitely my hyper.
Absolutely. That's super interesting. And you're reminding me of another mass die-off sort of story, or small die-off story, which is the Mac also shipped with McPaint and McDraw and McWrite. And I used McDraw, McPaint, whatever, but I'm a vector graphics guy. And I used McDraw to draw my own illustrations for research that we were sending out to our clients. Like, I didn't need to send something to some graphics person and say, do this for me. I did this over and over and over, and it worked out just fine. Thank you very much. And then a couple of things happened. Somehow, McDraw and its lookalikes just disappeared from the marketplace. And the ante was, well, do you want to learn Illustrator or Photoshop or what? And I looked over the fence at Photoshop and Illustrator, had nobody to coach me through them, and realized how sophisticated and complicated they were. And I just stopped. And only recently am I playing with some tools that I kind of like in the drawing tool space. There's something called Excalidraw, which is a plugin for Obsidian, which lets me draw graphics where the text in the graphics actually is connected to the text in the wiki and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like excited about that finally again, because I might be able to draw an interactive vector drawing that isn't just art, but is in fact a representation of something that leads to conversations. Anyway, this is kind of the way I want the tools for thinking space to evolve a little bit.
I was going to say, so the designer and researcher Chaim Gingold, he has this term, and maybe I'm kind of misusing it entirely from the way he kind of imagines it, but it's called magic crayons. And the idea is like by analogy with like the children's book Harold and the Purple Crayon, like where I love that book. He colors the world and like becomes a real world, and he now can inhabit it. And his argument is that like we need more of these kind of computational magic crayons that are simple enough that it eliminates that kind of barrier between like what you have in your mind and what you actually can do. And like and what Molly was saying, like unless you're coached, like for Photoshop, like there is this very high barrier between kind of what is in your mind and what you actually want to make. And some of these newer tools are kind of becoming more magic crayon-like. And I think we just need more and more of these kind of magic crayons to really kind of, just allow people to have that magical sense of creating and lowering the barrier between the idea and what they want.
And one of the barriers, Molly, you brought this into the conversation earlier, is the weird tension between commercial, startup-y, profitable things. Sam, you mentioned it as well, and what I'll just call the commons. And the idea of putting software in the commons and of developing objects, digital objects that we put in the commons in some shared way. So Wikipedia is fully in the commons. It's built using open source software. All the conversations around Wikipedia are openly available. You can join them, you can read them. Like Wikipedia is my favorite example of something that's open kind of almost every which way you look at it. And this battle between proprietary or private and open is ongoing. I'm thrilled with how much open source software has really sort of eaten the world in a lot of ways, but yet there's all sorts of funny things happening. So I think that's another one of the both mental and business dynamic barriers that need to be broken through for us to get into more of a golden age again of creative tools. Do you hit that a lot? Do you see that? Does that frustrate you in finding people or initiatives to fund? What role does that play?
I think for me personally, I notice that all the time. I think there's very few incentives for interoperability at the more kind of like consumer level. It's much more exchange kind of like at the base infrastructure, and that is wonderful and great. But I think even that is like the incentives are still needing some tinkering to like actually incentivize and reward people for sticking to things instead of just putting them on the backs of people and then forgetting about those people. But I do think that there is like in some ways we really do need the commercial packaging to bring things into a form that is like actually catering to people, like the average customer. And I think it really introduces more of like the common man perspective of like, how do we actually make this a tool that my third grader cousin can use or something like that, instead of thinking more of it from like a open source perspective. How can we push the future of computing? I think that both need to happen, but I think that they're not talking to each other very well, or working together. And I think it is hard too, because from the perspective of like the funding models that we have currently, it's really hard to kind of justify investing in anything but the ones that are catering to a broader market and aren't kind of nichifying themselves. But that's a shame, because the nichify ones are the ones that are kind of like those profits that push us forward. So I think both need to exist, but it almost to me points to just the need for more kind of investing in innovation for the sake of innovation and not for the sake of profit, for like the long-term health of the ecosystem of just like creative tools and computing more broadly, which is a really hard nut to crack, to be fair.
It's really hard. Absolutely. I remember back in the early days of the inner tubes, there was a website called Net Noir, which was for the Black community, and it was considered a niche site. And I'm like, seriously, how is an audience that large considered just a niche? And they were running into troubles because of that, because they weren't seen as this, broadly popular site. It's kind of crazy. One of the things that gives me a little heart here, a little hope, is that people are like using Instagram and Snapchat and Tumblr and a whole bunch of other tools, and they're adding hashtags, which is metadata, and they're gaming the hashtags, and they're doing all sorts of clever and funny things with metadata, without speaking the words metadata or anything like that. And the tools are remarkably sophisticated within this sort of the small domain of what they're trying to do, whether it's adding filters or effects or riffing, what's it called, doubling or twinning, duets or duos on TikTok. I think it's duets, where you can basically embed somebody else's TikTok, and then somebody else embeds the combination, and then somebody else embeds and you get this recursive little snail shell of people riffing on some theme. That's pretty interesting and sophisticated, right? How do we get ourselves more of that? And I'll put something else on the table which might lead to that, which is, and Molly, you were writing about this some, the need for modularity, and the word I like here is composability. How do we create software that is composable so that you can make new things with it, because the software plays nicely with other bits of code from other places that had other intentions, but suddenly these pieces can mesh and create something in between. Molly, can you sort of talk about how this modular design or interoperability comes into your world? Yeah,
totally. I think about this in a perhaps a little bit pessimistic way. I think it's really, really hard to actualize. I think it's usually the instances I see today are kind of more within like the universe of a certain large software company. They will start to make kind of like their modular little ecosystem, like Snapchat has like Snap Kits or something like that. Like they'll create something for people to play with, because there is kind of this desire to kind of like make something new and like play with these tools, especially when they're fun and all of your friends are there, and expressing ourselves is like an innate human thing, and pushing the bounds of the tools is incredibly fun. But I do think it is quite sad that this is almost entirely always relegated to within one company. And they usually don't play that well together. And they really don't have any incentive to either. And so I find that a little bit disheartening, but not at all. Like, I think that there is an increasing desire with the amount of time that we spend online, and especially in these tools that people increasingly love. Like, I think that there's becoming more of and more like affinity and kind of like identity appeal to tools. I think Figma is probably like a good example of just like people really find themselves there. And I think that that kind of like feeling of kinship with the tool means that they're willing to like invest more, as seen through just like the communities that spring up around these things, and the people that want to contribute and like make it better and make this vision that they have in their head to augment it in some way. And that is motivating to me. I just hope that they kind of start to think broader of like how the different tools that because like something like Obsidian could definitely work with a tool like Muse or something like that. It would be wonderful if these things are kind of thinking more about the broader ecosystem of people are not just coming to them for everything, which is unfortunately kind of the incentive in the current model of funding, is that every company should be kind of like a monopoly that does everything.
Exactly. And I kind of wanted to head right back where you're heading right now, which is that the world of business has nicely co-opted the term ecosystem, although mostly the way it's used, they have no understanding of what an actual ecosystem does or is. And they kind of want to have their own thriving private ecosystem. Like, hey, there we have a terrarium where all these people have jumped in and are doing cool things, with our tool and with our environment. But wait, you mean there's other terrariums out there? That's mean. They shouldn't do that. And so the commons is kind of the connective glue, I think, that would help us bridge and connect and make all these things work together. It's very interesting. We were talking earlier about prophets of the future, and one of them is Ted Nelson, who had a vision he called Xanadu. And small, fun side story, one of the earliest articles, I think one of the first trips I ever made to Silicon Valley, I met with the president of Xanadu company, Roger Gregory, who to this day was the geekiest human I've ever met. Geekiest looking. He had a relatively large girth, and he had a t-shirt on 2 sizes too small. So there were like 3 inches of belly button showing like at all times and like that. And then I wrote an article about Xanadu for our research publication, which said in 2 years, they're going to have something in the marketplace. And this is probably back in the mid 90s. Imagine my surprise in 2012, 15, somewhere in there, to read an article about Xanadu that says they're going to have something in the market in 2 years. And so I've sort of seen this show before. It's like, wow, some deep, big visions, like Ted Nelson certainly had a deep, big vision, didn't make it through. But then terms from what he cared about, like transclusion, are very popular in the tools for thinking space. Like things that he brought into the world are actually in play and in conversation. And we're trying to figure out, okay, how's linking different from deep linking, different from transclusion, different from some other method of connecting things to each other. And I think that the tools for thinking space is sort of inchoate. Part of what we're trying to do with this podcast series and the Think Camp is paint the edges of the field a little bit. Not to bound it and limit it, but rather to say, hey, it also includes the stuff over here, and it also includes the stuff over here. And if you build your tool in a composable, plays well with others kind of way, you don't have to write that code. You can actually play with the power tools that other people are busy building in the field next door. And that's kind of I think a piece of what we'd like to see. Sorry for the long preamble here, but are you seeing this ethos or this way of looking at things grow, or is this just wishful thinking on my part and maybe your part? Like, do you see us heading into a space where this might actually start to happen properly?
I think I personally do, but I think it's very small bits and bots that can kind of be justified either as a play to attract the type of people that would be interested in something like transclusion, which is like a growing number of people I think are interested in just like better tools for thinking. But I also think it's hard because oftentimes they are more tailored towards like personal use cases and things that are a little bit harder to justify in a roadmap that is like thinking more about owning an ecosystem or a terrarium, which I quite like that metaphor. But I do think that we will see them. They'll just like come in getting kind of like slotted into the new indie tools that are like pushing at the frontier of innovation. And then they'll slowly like trickle down into like the Microsoft suite of things. But I think it does take a long time. And I think that most of them are, they are oftentimes very idealistic, and they only kind of work in visions of computing that are very far from where we are now. So it is hard because sometimes it feels like they are getting pushed forth and tested and evaluated in a world that is not really ready or understands how to use them properly, nor are we even thinking about interacting with computers in the way that they were like intended and like framed to be used in. But I'm optimistic. I think it's been cool to see just the kind of proliferation of all kinds of interesting tools popping up that are really pushing, especially in like the note-taking space. I feel like that one has been really kind of doubled down on in terms of these visions that we had in the past of like how it could be better. I think everyone's a bit fed up with just the plain Google Doc.
It's true. Sam?
Yeah, and I guess I would add, I mean, when you're thinking, and especially in terms of like expanding the space of like what are these things kind of in the space of tools for thinking, I guess to use an analogy, and like when you think about like the internet, like people say, oh, like now that everything's online, it'll just be easy to find all the information you want. But the truth is it's not, because of like jargon barriers. So if you don't even know what to look for, you can't find those things. And I think with a lot of these kind of like, what is the broad space of tools for thinking? People either get kind of slotted into and certain things, maybe like hypercard-like things, or certain things around note-taking tools, and like, and it's like, but like, and never the twain shall meet kind of thing. But like the truth is they're all working together. And I think the more we can say, okay, like highlighting like what are like the key ideas of composability or modularity or whatever, and recognizing that all these things are relevant for all the different areas that are playing that they're playing with together. And it's the kind of thing where it also needs to be said that like, unlike creating terrarium, like not everyone needs to solve all these different problems. You can hopefully create something that will then, like, the best of note taking will be combined with the best of some hypercard like thing or whatever it is. Then those things will all kind of work together, but still kind of be the best versions of themselves. So I am, I guess, cautiously optimistic for where this is all going. I think there's, and I think it's one of the nice things where these communities, and I still feel like it's still plural here, they're slowly but surely recognizing that they all need to kind of come together. Not necessarily.
Are they? Because I'm not so sure. I think that there's like, I refer to them as bonfires on the horizon.
Maybe it's wishful thinking.
Like
to over
that bonfire way over there, that's the Tuttle custom community, and over there is the cult of Rome, and way over there are other people doing whatever, and the Tiddlywiki or Fediverse people, or here's Ward Cunningham, the smallest federated wiki kind of thing, and some of them have people who are bumblebees or bridge builders and know a lot about these different movements, but I don't see them cross-pollinating sort of enough from my own perspective. It's like they're each trying to invent the world from the perspective of what they see. I may be blind here.
Yeah, it could be that, and maybe I'm kind of like looking at this from the perspective of the bumblebee or the bridge.
Yeah,
So it feels like these things,
talking to a bumblebee,
like they all have lots of kind of connections, or at least like various people who actually kind of know the different players in different areas. And so maybe it's a matter of like these communities can kind of continue doing their things, but we need to just make like a thicker bridge. I was actually just reading about kind of the old version of like London Bridge, where it was not just a bridge across the Thames, and people lived on it, and there were houses and there were houses and stores and all these different things. And I think, and maybe that's what needs to happen, is where there are all these communities that are kind of becoming the best versions of themselves, but the bridges also become communities themselves, and those bridges kind of can actually foster little communities too. And maybe that's going to be the most most exciting things will be happening there.
I like that a lot.
Thank you. Hopefully the analogy does not break down too much.
No, not at all. I'm about to like drop a different analogy in the conversation that will maybe confuse things more. But in my efforts to try to figure out how to invoke sort of the mycelial links between these sorts of things, I put up thebigfungus.org. And part of the reason I called it the big fungus, I explain on the site briefly, but leafcutter ants can't actually digest leaf matter. So why on earth are they up in the trees, snipping off little bits of leaves and carrying them into the hive? Well, they're handing them off to a subgenus of that kind of ant, which mulches up the leaf matter and feeds it to a fungus, inoculates a fungus with it that metabolizes the leaf matter and oozes little tasty fungus parts and some nectar, so happy fungus, happy hive. They have a symbiotic relationship. And I've been feeding a mind map for 25 years in one particular quirky proprietary tool called the brain, but I felt like a lone ant at the fungus face for 25 years going, where is everybody? Like this is really joyful. I have a lot of fun. Part of the problem in my life is that I get a little dopamine hit when I put something in the right place in my brain, and it sort of snaps in like that puzzle piece you couldn't find for a couple hours, and then you found it and you click it in, like, there's a sense of pleasure and completion. Because also for many years, I have this idea that there's two audiences for my brain thing. There's me, but I publish my brain openly on the web. So there's everybody else. And I'm trying to figure out how to use my brain to inoculate the big fungus for all of us. And so for me, the big fungus is just a metaphoric way of expressing that space between us, where we can share what we believe, what we saw, what we hope will happen, what we think will happen, what we're up to, all those kinds of things in some way that lets us connect it to evidence, motivation, reasoning, what have you, right? There's a little subgenre called argumentation theory, where there's debate sites and a couple other sites. I've got a whole list of them, but it's a narrow thing where you have assertion, pro, con, evidence, arguments, et cetera, et cetera. That's kind of one way to think about it, but that narrows it down really quickly to just a little piece. And I'm afraid that this big fungus is either really far away or we're already doing it. We just don't know it and haven't labeled it properly. Do either of you want to work in the big fungus?
Sounds like a great place to live, like to dwell. Yeah. I want to live in the big fungus in terms of like within all these information.
Me too.
And I would say, and there's the whole space of like digital gardens where people are kind of like doing this for themselves. But the question becomes, how do you kind of create paths between people's digital gardens? And I think that's the key to kind of create that big fungus. And so now I'm really mixing lots of biological.
I love this. This is the land of mixed metaphors. Welcome to it.
But I think that's the key. It's like how do you kind of feel comfortable making your own kind of mental map of information, cultivate your own digital garden, but still also make sure that it's open enough and welcoming enough to interact with other people's gardens. And I don't know if I have the answer to that, but yeah. But if we did that, then the big fungus would happen.
And just to complicate things, other people's gardens or visions of this whole thing will look different. And, I've been using this quirky brain thing. Some small percentage of the human population on the little bell chart sees my brain and goes, oh, I get that, and then starts using it and jumps right in. Another small portion needs my guidance. And when I'm tour guiding in the brain, they're like, oh, I get it now. There's a whole bunch of other people for whom it's like, ooh, just a tangle of words and links, and I don't really get it. But for them, some other representational scheme works really, really well and clicks in place. So how do we create a space where we can honor different people's preferences for the tools and still create a shared and useful memory that lets us sort of bootstrap our way forward?
I'm really interested in this question. I have no answers whatsoever, but I think it's like one of the most kind of high leverage activities in terms of instigating or inspiring creativity and curiosity, and just like getting more people to feel like they are welcome and understood, and just they are inspired by the things that they see. I think that there's just like a lot of different ways that we could play with both the internet and computers to make it so that you're really customizing your experience to be maximally interesting to you and make the most sense. And I think that we don't do that. We just kind of prescribe a one size fits all for most things. And that works for the most part. I mean, we need standards that like people learn and how to interact with computers. But I do think that there is a huge gap oftentimes. And the best example is even just like very simple kind of mediums such as like writing. Like some people just like don't read anymore books, and they will read short form things. And I think that there is something to be said for, I wish that computers gave more of an experience of letting you really like kind of consume content and software and just like interact with things at the level of abstraction that you want to. And that's something that I'm very interested in, just like how tools can do that all in one place instead of making you go to like multiple different tools for different levels of like abstraction. And an example of that is more just like, yeah, Photoshop is like a very complex piece of software, but if you go to something like Miro or something like that, it's like you can very quickly have a canvas and make something that is a vision of what you had in your head, and it feels easy and approachable. And like, what is the difference there? What is the gap that keeps people from going from Miro to making something that is like exactly what they were looking for? And I think that is a big drop-off point that is a real shame.
I totally agree. One of the other forces for me is My last 30 years were informed by realizing back a long time ago that I didn't like the word consumer. And I think that we were turned into mere consumers instead of being treated as citizens anymore. And there's a whole bunch of logic and interesting stuff I can point to there. But one of the things that happens when you're being treated as a consumer is you get learned helplessness. You wind up being dumber than you would be if you're being treated as a citizen with mutual responsibilities and interdependencies. And there's a word here that we haven't, I don't think, said yet, which I think is really important, which is agency. The felt sense of agency. And agency is some combination of responsibility, permission, and intention to go do something, to go, and in this case, I think in the context of our conversation, to fix, improve, sort of the shared asset of what we know in this sense, or to do something better for humanity. And we've kind of managed to very effectively kill off agency to the point where we're in the society of the spectacle and people are busy like doing TikToks and whatever else as entertainment. And it's, it's Netflix and Nintendo or whatever else has replaced a lot of things that we used to do with and for each other. And so I think the optimism we're voicing in this call is in the face of a thunderstorm that is just about, hey, I'm just a consumer anymore and nobody treats me as like a citizen. So what I'm going to do doesn't matter. The problems are too big. There's just this deep sense of apathy, but also a lack of agency. And a piece of why I think designs head back toward there's a regression to the mean and toward the desktop metaphor or Microsoft Office or whatever is that there's not a large number of people out there clamoring for the new creative thing. There's a bunch of people saying, okay, what's the minimum I need to learn or do to get on this platform, which I now have to use? Oh God, Zoom and Miro. It's pandemic time. Give me Zoom and Miro and some Google Docs. And okay, what's the minimum I can do to survive in that world? And I would love to be in the big fungus with people who are like, hey, how do we explore and experiment and build some new stuff together here that's easy and accessible? That's just a little bit more complicated than Instagram with hashtags. Right? That's one of my design questions is it can't be as complicated as Photoshop. That's a lot. You can't ask everybody to invest like that, right? For anybody who learned word processing in the days of WordStar, like they had to embed in the back parts of their brain a whole bunch of arcane key combos that once embedded in the brain were like really quick and powerful and very hard to get out. Like they like hooked in pretty deep. So how do we make this easy? And part of what I want to ask you both is, well, let me get back to that. But I just wanted to put agency into the conversation and see what you think about that.
I wonder is this partly due to, I'm sure there's many reasons why we kind of have like a lack of agency, but like when I think about tech news, the way in which it's often like the way in which we consume news around technology, it's often around it's not like what is like the future hold or kind of what can we do together and what can we build. It's much more, okay, what is the newest gadget and what are the different things that I can like consume, and going back to kind of this consumer mode. And so I wonder, and it's not to blame tech news, but I just
go ahead.
If okay, but it's more just about that, and there might be a feedback there that as people kind of get more into the kind of the consumption mode, then people then think about, okay, what is technology? It's just like a series of new iPhones, or it's a series of new versions of software X or whatever it is, versus saying, okay, what are the things that I want to do and how can I kind of make that a reality? And this kind of goes back to what we were discussing earlier around when you can kind of see the relationship between like, okay, like when you know it's possible to build some things or to kind of create certain things, or whether it's end user programming or something kind of much lower and easier, then there's a sense of, okay, here's a sense of possibility of like, here are the different things that I want technology to be able to do, versus here are the things that I'm just given, and that now takes this high dimensional space of creative possibilities and has reduced it to, I don't know, two-dimensional surface.
Absolutely.
I
It's
think
flatland.
Yeah, there's something really interesting too about, I think one of the things that really enthralled me about the technology industry, coming from like an entertainment background and working in film, is that there is so much agency imbued into the very people that are working on these products usually, because I think the fast feedback loops of coding and just like realizing something really quickly is like very unique actually. And there's very little barrier to entry to make something that does something incredible for you personally. Like you can solve your own problems. And I think that is actually somewhat of a drug that people get a bit hooked on and actually are in a very good way. Like it is something that they can kind of build dreams on and kind of expand their scope and scale of imagination and think bigger. I think we currently as an industry are a bit in like a weird, awkward teenage phase of like not really having a vision and just kind of doing the incremental stuff of just puttering along and kind of being in high school and figuring it all out. But I do hope that we kind of take the reins more in terms of like what we're really aiming for instead of the incremental improvements. And I think it's a shame that there is such a big gap between oftentimes the products that are made by the technology industry are so kind of like taking away agency versus the people that are working on them are like gaining agency. And there's like a weird kind of relationship there that I've never really understood. And I think it's mostly just in terms of like feedback loops and like what gets the fastest response in terms of money. Like if you solve people's problems and you do it quickly and you take that away, that is inherently usually taking away some agency. Maybe they're gaining it back in a different capacity, but oftentimes not. Oftentimes it's just like a very small problem to solve. But then like after we've solved all those small problems, like then what do we do? I think that's the question that I'm more interested in. And what has always made me the most excited about technology is that we can think about those questions. It's like kind of reaching a new baseline. But I do think that I'm not currently, at least personally, seeing many people really taking the reins. And I think it requires narratives, it requires storytelling, it requires more profits that are compelling to people beyond just the tech industry too, and tech really like being more in conversation with the broader culture too, and kind of like taking it seriously and not speaking such a different language that it's almost like they're kind of talking over each other.
Exactly. How do you feed your vision?
That's a good question. I don't really know. I mean, I think for me personally, I am very inspired by like classic sci-fi, like most people, as well as just personally people that I know that I find very inspiring and seem to really have somewhat of like the old spirit of technology. Like they remind me of like the Bell Labs people. And they're just like tinkering and kind of pushing the bounds and not thinking as much about like, will this make me a lot of money? And more thinking about like, will this change the way that people relate to these machines that they use every day? That's a much more interesting prompt. And I think the more time that I spend around those people, the more I am just convinced that there is something really special here. And like what made them that way is like an interesting question. And I think in some ways it's characteristics of like some people are just naturally innately more curious and like that. But I think it is also like those short feedback loops and like being able to make something entirely on your own and not really needing a team or anyone's approval. That is a really special thing that I wish that technology itself was actually spreading the magic that was used to create it in some ways.
Yeah, and I think like the key word here is like in terms of vision is like magic is what you said. Like we've been talking about prophecy, but there's also just like the wizardry of coding, which is, I mean, it's the ability to write text that then will actually do something on the screen. And like, and that was a magical feeling. Like the first time I could program something and like, I don't make some like weird little animation or something on the screen that was kind of like a screensaver or whatever it was. And I think the question becomes, okay, how do we democratize that sense of magic and sorcery? And unfortunately, the problem is that when we think about the world of magic and like in many ways, it's like, oh, it's this esoteric lore and we can't democratize it. And it's kind of like part of this priesthood. And the answer is no, we should be sharing it with everyone. Like everyone should have this feeling of like crackling power through text or whatever it is. I kind of actually, having that small feedback loop and actually there is so a designer, Casey Climbs, he actually wrote this thing about like Molly, what you were saying of like, how do you kind of make sure there's agency both for the users as well as for the creators? And so he has this space, he calls it design for emergence. And the idea is like to create software that allows for kind of a certain amount of open-endedness even for the users. And I think that's something that we haven't quite not optimized for, but not even like thought about as deliberately as we could. And I think that's something really important there.
Love that. Design for Emergence also, Ann Pendleton, Julian, and John C. Lee Brown have been doing a bunch in that space as well. It's really interesting. And just the whole idea of emergence and letting go of control and offering people power, letting people be aware of their power, all of those kinds of things are, I think, scary to people who'd rather just like have a lot of eyeballs come through and like cash that in somehow.
The creators need to be okay with being surprised by their creations.
It's so back in the day, Prodigy, back in the early days of Prodigy, they added like a chat, sort of a community conversation feature or an email feature on just as a last minute add-on, just thinking that they would use it to communicate with people on what's for sale. And then Prodigy users started to self-organize against Prodigy by using the internal chat feature. And the executives of Prodigy were aghast and like scared and everything else. It's really pretty funny. I mean, when you look back at sort of the more innocent days of all this stuff, it's really, I'm happy to have a lifespan that's long enough that I learned to run a key punch machine for a Fortran class that I dropped out of. But, I've punched cards and submitted the deck and taken the readouts back and done some of that, all the way to like this little slab of unobtainium that's in my pocket all the time that has like endless battery life and who knows what else. It's craziness. It's complete craziness. And yet so many people are using that either just to take pictures and post in the Snapchat or whatever else, that the creativity that we're talking about here, which is now enormously facilitated by power tools at our disposal and free storage. I remember the day when I was starting to make some videos and I was like, how am I going to serve up those videos? Do I have to like rent a server space somewhere? And then like YouTube shows up and for free eats that space. And I have been posting, I have multiple hundreds of videos I posted to YouTube. And I was like, thank you so much for fixing that. So in this world, how do we, what's missing, what's dead, what's alive? How do we feed it? What's the creative cycle here? Or are there places, communities, groups, circles, companies, whatever organizations that you've bumped into where this energy is alive and well and just like on fire?
I think for me, what comes up is like that we would greatly benefit from doing more thinking into kind of what makes people feel fulfilled by their work and what they do. And I think that one of the gaping holes that we have neglected to poorly kind of build into computers and in many forms is actually friction. Like I think that we've made everything so smooth and seamless that we don't really derive the same satisfaction. And we kind of are optimizing for the more kind of mammalian instincts that we have, which is just like getting things done quickly, like getting dopamine hits, all of these things. And this is very like a very trite argument, but I do think that technology needs to kind of like rethink what we really want from these tools and how we want to feel when we use them. And I think I'm very inspired by, like I said, like the indie tools, ones like Muse and Obsidian that are just a little bit more kind of like you're making your own environment that is uniquely your own and just how you're thinking about it. And it's also the right level of friction. Like, I think that there is something about that that gives you the same experience and satisfaction that you would get from something that is like creating in the real world. And I think that that is ideally good to parallel those more. But I do think that there is also kind of work to be done to reinvent what is a new path too, not just like reinventing or like replicating the, paper paradigms or things like that. It's like, what is the actual vision that we have for what computers can be that isn't just making them either as flat and frictionless as possible or replicating what we already have. Like, I think that there is other things to explore. And that's why I'm always excited too by people who are kind of pushing the bounds in terms of like new programming languages or new ways of like visualizing and grouping things that really kind of question and make us kind of go back to the baseline and think about how we want to frame these things, as well as like coding tools that are actually just like dramatically simplifying learning to code so that you are kind of rethinking and seeing all the possibilities at kind of the ground level. I find that very inspiring as well.
Yeah, I guess I would add, I mean, related to what you're saying with like introducing a little bit of friction, I feel like there's looking for the most interesting things is often found like when it's people or organizations or tools that try to avoid the paths of least resistance. So there's kind of like the things that we're shunted into, whether it's the paper paradigm or whether it's certain organizational structures, whether it's like doing something entirely academic or doing something only in kind of a large fast scaling startup. The people who are kind of pushing against those structures, but kind of either intellectual structures, organizational structures, or whatever it is. Those are the people who often are so enamored by some sort of idea they want to make that they're willing to like try a little bit harder and kind of do something that doesn't fit. And so those are the kind of people and the organizations and the ideas that I think are most exciting to look at. And oftentimes like the indie tools, like they fit in there. And so, yeah, that I would say those are the areas that I'm often inspired by.
And it's funny because I've had a lot of years now as a tech industry trends analyst, which I no longer do, but I remember meeting a guy named Sandy Klausner who had invented a thing that was sort of a new stack that had security, had a bunch of other things, and it went all the way down from like chips from hardware all the way up to reinventing the web and networks and all that. Except he had drawn the whole thing in Director. And at one point, the Macintosh changed their screen resolution from rectangles to squares or vice versa. But the whole screen resolution of the Mac changed. And that screwed up all of the drawings that he had done for his whole system called Cubicon. And so for years afterward, he had to buy old Macs, and he was trying to keep alive with a little CPR, old Mac, because he wasn't a coder and he couldn't find resources or funding to program the thing. And then at one point I brought in 3 or 4 of my geek friends in Silicon Valley, and they spent some time with him. And one of them, a genius, said, okay, so he seems to have reinvented a very simple garbage collection routine and then this other very sophisticated version of it. And I can see it drawn in these icons in this new language, right? But that language is likely never ever to make it to the sea, so to speak. Like he's landlocked, and I'm not even sure, he would need a bunch of precogs bathed in a solution with jacks in the back of their heads to retrain people to use everything he had invented from soup to nuts. So I've had the sort of pleasure and rueful pleasure, let's call it, of meeting a few people like that who've invented something big and cool, but you can sort of see it's not going to make it out. And so how do we create a more experimental pit where people aren't drawn back into the tractor beam and have some space to experiment? And then I'm also noting that we now have like the metaverse is big. And since Zuckerberg decided to rename Facebook into Meta, the metaverse got even bigger. And I wrote a post complaining about it. And shortly after that, I bought the domain thebetterverse.org, because I was like, there seem to be 2 major visions of the metaverse being pitched right now. One is Zuckerberg, who just renamed this behemoth company as Meta. But then if you watch the video, it's like would have made Second Life users like giggle 10 years ago, like how primitive the demo was. I'm like, really, there's nothing new here, and it's not a world I want to inhabit. And then the other one is coming out of crypto, DAOs, NFTs. Our metaverse is going to be that. And I'm like, I'm not sure I like that one either. Velvet rope Discord servers where you're flipping NFTs and putting up bids on smart contracts on the DAO. I don't know. So part of what I'm hoping is that together we can develop a betterverse. And I feel with this quirky proprietary tool called the brain, like I'm trying to build the betterverse because I'm trying to puzzle together what do people believe, why, what might we do, what would be a good policy platform, all those kinds of things that feel to me more useful than, hey, look, I've got a gorilla avatar that's purple and can fly. And so how do we create hard fun? How do we make environments where what we do has purpose and meaning? I mean, Molly, we were talking earlier about, people looking for purpose. There is purpose right at hand. It's just that none of the commercial entities are highly motivated to let us dwell on purpose, because then we might actually fix things in the world. I'm being a little cynical here. Sorry.
Not at all. No, I agree. I think about this prompt a lot. I think that I'm the most kind of drawn to solving this problem at the base level of just like, I think that some of this will be solved if more people are just taught to code at a younger age. Like if it's made simple and interesting and easy for them, then so many doors are unlocked to finding things that they never thought would be interesting or possible to either appreciate or make themselves. And I think that really just comes down to, teaching people at the right age in the right context. And yeah, just like making it much more kind of immediately addictive in the same way that we've learned how to make so many other things addictive. Like let's make something that actually gives people basically superpowers addictive. And then I think that just unlocks an appreciation for having tipped your toes even a little bit into like coding. Then you can kind of like see like the people that are making their own kind of little universes and better verses and things of that sort. It's like that is an incredible thing, and that is something that we should all be kind of like thinking about what our version is if we're interested, or at least kind of seeing and experimenting and challenging our own conceptions of like what the worlds that we're dwelling in are and like how it's kind of impacting us.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, kind of to go back to like evolutionary biology metaphors, I think the larger the population and the larger amount of variation in that population that we have, so like the different kinds of visions of betterverses and metaverses and things like that we have, the better options we have as a society to actually choose. Because without that, we're going to be shunted into like one of two possibilities or one of three possibilities, and we need more. And so I agree with Molly. Like the more we can allow people to have the ability and the power and the tools to actually build these different kinds of things and allow people to experiment, then I think people will hopefully have the opportunity to choose and to figure out what makes sense. Anything in terms of like figuring out meaning and purpose, I'm not sure that can be solved entirely by technology or even at all. But I think that's the kind of thing of like, as a society, we might need to think about that kind of more broadly. But the more we have that conversation as a society, and the more tools that we have that can fit different versions of that, then hopefully we can find ways where those things actually accord nicely, and there's a nice matchmaking function.
My favorite example of ways that people start to get a sense of agency is when they learn how Wikipedia gets edited. And so I'll ask an audience, does everybody remember the first time they saw Wikipedia? Or first I'll say, who uses Wikipedia? And like 99% of the hands go up. Who remembers when they first saw it? A fewer hands go up. Who remembers the first time they realized how it works? Right? That any idiot, any fool on the planet can go edit the Encyclopedia for Humanity. It's like, what idiot invented this system? But for me, I love telling the story, because for me, when it dawns on them that that's happening in the background, but still the thing is pretty good and reliable, and then they go into something that they really care about, like episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and they figure out that there's even a Wikipedia page for Buffy studies, which is like an academic field now, believe it or not. That they then go, oh, this is working in an interesting way. How do I get more? Because I think they start to have a sense that that ordinary citizens are busy changing the world. I might want to jump in and help, or do something in some area that I care about. So I love Wikipedia as this sort of little taste of agency. And I think learning to code, being immersed in Photoshop really, really early, using HyperCard and starting to program in HyperTalk, all these stories that we've got, and I've got my own version of those things, gave us a sense that we could build, make, do, play in this world. And it's at least a piece of why we're so optimistic, I'll say, at the end even of this conversation, that this is doable and that we might actually be getting someplace. So we're getting close to the end of our call, and I'm just wondering, like, what if you had a magic button or a magic lantern or whatever, what would you wish would happen, or we could do, or people would start to think or do, that would bring these wishful thinking ideas a little closer to reality? I know. It reminds me of my favorite Peanuts cartoon, which has Peppermint Patty sitting in her desk at school, and she picks up her test paper and it says, "Explain World War II." And then it says, "Use both sides of the page if necessary."
Great.
Yeah, I mean, well, and certainly this is, I think, a non-answer, but something that hopefully we kind of maybe point towards more of an answer. But I mean, and when you're talking about Wikipedia, the fact that Wikipedia works and like that's kind of one of the things that I just feels like it should make everyone feel very hopeful about humanity. And so I think if we can create like other tools for creativity like that make us equally hopeful for like the creative potential for humanity, then we're in good shape. What that is, I don't know. And I think I'm actually quite okay not knowing the answer. I kind of just want there to be more possibilities. I often view this as like when we when we're trying to like figure out, like examine some high dimensional space, I'm agnostic as to what version is going to win out. I just want there to be more out there. And so I want there to kind of be a diversity of options and possibilities that everyone who wants to play with these different tools will feel comfortable with something.
I love that. And then we have to figure out our way to talk to each other through the big fungus or whatever this thing winds up getting called.
I think for me, if I had to pick some kind of silver bullet, I would go back to I just think mandatory coding education would be a really net, wonderful thing for so many of these problems, because it would give everyone a taste that they actually can impact them. And they have both agency and inspiring examples of how they can do so. But I think beyond that, I'm really interested also in the just storytelling and kind of philosophy aspect of technology, and how we both just need more narratives that are inspiring to get into it and to make something ourselves, and also just kind of a rebranding of where technology fits into our lives, less as something that is kind of like an addition that just speeds things up, and more of something that can be a massive expander of all of our conceptions of what is possible, conceptions of what the world can be. And also just like can solve really, really big problems, and is a tool. That at the end of the day, that's all technology is. But it's a really incredible one. And so I think what that actually boils down to practically is just like better movies that paint interesting visions of technology that aren't just sci-fi, but are also, I think, like I often cite The Social Network was like a very, very huge catalyst for so many people going into the industry. And I think we need more narratives like that are kind of expanding and inspiring in other directions. That was an interesting, good one that filtered for kind of more people like that. But I think we also need narratives that are more kind of the long-term visionary, that had this prophetic vision for some kind of software language or something like that. And it's just very interesting and inspiring, and also respected. And I think that technology in its kind of teenage phase just needs to kind of grow up. And I think that really comes in the form of taking control of its narrative in many different realms and vicinities, and people embodying that.
Yeah. And I would add, and as Molly was saying this, it made me realize that one of the things I would also want, kind of related to the storytelling, is better knowledge of technological history. I think like understanding where we came from and what paths we took and what paths we didn't can give us a better sense of where we might want to go for the future.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think that it should be like definitely a subject that is taught in like even high school. Like it's so interesting too. And I'm not even saying that from a nerdy perspective, but also just like people like these things that we play with all the time. And it's interesting to see like how they've evolved. I think that oftentimes so many people are surprised by how much kind of fodder for thought there is along the path, and the people that kind of instigated these things. The stories are interesting, just like inherently.
I was just trying to book an episode of this podcast around some history, and I contacted two people who know me personally, who I haven't talked to in a long time. I said, "Hey, would you like to be on a podcast about this?" And they both turned me down. And I was like, "Hey, I don't do a lot of podcasts, whatever." One of them was like, "I'm super busy with a startup," and I was just really dismayed, because I think these stories need to be told and retold, and in some case, they just need to be recorded and posted someplace, so that people can bump into them. One of my lifelong regrets is that when I was an adult and was with my grandparents, why didn't I sit them down and say, "Could you tell me the difficult stories that you never wanted to tell me because you were afraid I'd have a terrible life if I knew how hard your life was back in the day?" Because I'm now playing detective, trying to piece together those stories, right? And they don't exist because I didn't realize, hey, they're still coherent and alive. I should sit down and record these things with them. So trying to figure that out. And Molly, I'm so happy you mentioned storytelling, because there's a thought in my brain. I just posted it in our chat here, but it says, we are in a titanic battle over the narratives in our heads. By the way, we always have been. This is one of my amateur theories of history, is that history is a fight in the cockpit over the joystick of who gets control over society, over the current laws or regimes or whatever. We're witnessing it right now in this election cycle and the following election cycle in the US and worldwide. And storytelling is so crucial, because people don't respond all that well to facts. And a lot of the tools for thinking space, I think, comes back to, how do I organize facts? How do I, it's pretty logical, and the tools tend to be more analytic. And I think we're missing the mark on something really important here, which is the stories we tell matter vitally, and inform a whole lot of people, or misdirect a whole lot of people. The Adrian Hahn wrote a really great piece saying, is QAnon an ARG? Is QAnon an alternate reality game? And it's a really interesting thesis, because there is a keymaster or secret game runner who's busy dropping clues. Real things happen in the real world as a consequence. It's like really astonishing. And then you look into the stories that are part of the QAnon conspiracy theories, and you're like, wow, that's elaborate and actually pretty genius as a way to manipulate people. And then I had the idea, so how do you corrupt, invade, or hijack an ARG? And is there a way to enter the QAnon world with some other characters that take it in a better way? Because Donald Trump is now wearing Q pins and playing Q music at his rallies, and it's very frightening where this could go if we don't straighten out the narratives that people are buying into, right? And I think people they buy trust, they buy connection, and they buy story. And if you happen to have evidence along the way, oh, great. But in this little era that we're in, evidence and facts and truth are being deprecated anyway. So I'm not really necessarily going to believe those things. So it's a bit of a downer note to end our conversation on. But I believe we're at a moment in our history where figuring out some of these tools is actually essential to thriving as a species on the planet, because we have a lot of problems to sort out together. We have a lot of people who are apparently not convinced that we have a lot of problems to sort out together. And there's all sorts of opportunities to do better in that space. But it seems like a huge mission.
I very much agree. And it's like, who gets to use these tools is kind of the question. It's like, if they're always going to be relegated for the more analytical mind, I think that is massively just underutilizing the human brain as a whole. I think there's so many people in other areas, in other industries, that are thinking about really important things, and we need to give them the superpowers that they need to do that thinking the best that they possibly can, not just the ones that we kind of more readily understand because we are the makers of those tools.
Absolutely.
That's
absolutely great. Thank you. This has been really like a delightful conversation. I would love to do this like all day, every day. But this has been a magical moment with magic crayons and magic tools and everything else. And thank you all for listening to Tools for Thinking, a new podcast that might just help you with your thinking. If you're part of a startup in this sector, please knock on our door at betaworks.com/camp. And please build something genius and share it back with us. We'd love to hear from you.